There are two things about Đào Duy Anh that I really like. The first is that he tried to do something new, and the second is that he was incredibly objective. What is it that he tried to do new? Well, before he wrote his book in 1946, the historical accounts that Vietnamese had written in the modern era, in the 20th century, still closely followed the model of the dynastic history, and the Đại too in particular. What was that model? It argued that in the earliest times, there's this kind of mythical world of dragon men and fairy women who intermarry and who create this political genealogy that stretches back to antiquity and what we would call mythical figures in Chinese history. Đào Duy Anh felt that all of that stuff was just superstitious and you had to move beyond it. And the way that he did that was by adopting ideas that the French had introduced, ideas like race and human migration, and try to understand how those concepts could be applied to ancient Vietnamese history. And what he came up with was a story of the emergence of a race of Viet peoples in antiquity and their migration southward into the Red River Delta. And that was something entirely new and was very interesting. How did he do it? In many ways, he did it in the same way that Ngô Sĩ Liên created his imagined history about a political genealogy in antiquity when he wrote his Đại too in the 15th century. Ngô Sĩ Liên looked at ancient Chinese sources and found certain terms that referred to people and places in the south, such as Giao Ji, Lac Viet, and terms like that, and used those to try to create a history out of materials that Chinese had written centuries earlier. Đào Duy Anh did the same thing, but instead of trying to create a political genealogy, he tried to find evidence of race and human migration, and that was something very new. The other thing that was interesting about Đào Duy Anh is that when he looked at all of this stuff, he was very objective. Ultimately, what he found was that if you look at the ancient history of the Red River Delta, you see the emergence of things like bronze drums and a sophisticated culture there. But then once that culture came into contact with the Chinese world, it disappeared or was totally transformed. And to Đào Duy Anh, that was okay. Yes, it was sad that some ancient society essentially disappeared as it was transformed through contact with another society, but it's that transformation that created the Vietnamese culture that ultimately led to the Vietnamese of the 20th century. So from Đào Duy Anh's perspective, it was okay that these things had happened in the past. Historians who followed in Đào Duy Anh's footsteps, however, haven't been able to look at these transformations as objectively. And this has been one of the greatest struggles in the past half century in Vietnamese historiography, which is to try to find a way to explain away the fact that whatever existed in the Red River Delta before the Chinese came ultimately disappeared, and that what exists now is the product of a deep interaction and transformation through contact with an outside society, the Chinese. One way that people deal with this today is by trying to say that the Viet world that existed in the past was superior to the Chinese world, and that ultimately the Chinese world is indebted to the Vietnamese world. Anh also saw a dichotomy, but he saw things in the exact opposite way, because what he did was to base his ideas on information that's actually exists in historical sources. And what those sources argue is that that the Chinese were agriculturalists, and to their south were various people who hunted, who fished, and did things like that. And Đào Duy Anh believed that this was the original world of the Viet, and that it was only through contact with the Chinese world that that world came to be transformed. Again, it's much nicer to believe that the Viet had a great society first, that the Chinese were inferior, but Đào Duy Anh didn't need that. He looked at what he saw in the sources, came to his conclusions about what the reality was, and based those conclusions on what historical evidence actually exists. So again, Đào Duy Anh was someone who was very objective, and that's something I really like about him. He did stuff that was new, he was incredibly objective about what he saw, and that made him an incredible historian.